Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don. Welcome, everyone, to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions related to the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. My guest today is Devin Casey of the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, very involved in the CUI program, which I think is somewhat at the core of what we're doing with CMMC. We are recording these sessions as part of our continuing community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations seeking certification. So that's most of who is in the audience today. For those in the audience, if you have any questions today, please do send them in using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will try to answer as many of those audience questions as we can on our session here today. Let me start with a quick introduction of our guest, Devin Casey. Devin is a program analyst for the Information Security Oversight Office at the National Archives and Record Administration. He leads their implementation and oversight activities for the Controlled Unclassified Information Program. He leads development of the CUI Marking Handbook. He contributed to the development of the NIST SP 800-171 that we all know from as a kind of a predecessor of CMMC. Devin is the executive agent for the CUI program, and as such is on the government-wide CUI Advisory Council, and he chairs the CUI Registry Committee. So very much at the heart of what's going on with CUI in government today. He's also a sergeant in the Army Reserves working as an intelligence analyst. So Devin, thanks for joining us. First, thank you for your service, both in the military and your civil sector work. Both very critical to our national security, and we very much appreciate it. Within the world of CMMC, controlled unclassified information is really a pretty big deal. So for contractors, if you have CUI or you don't have CUI, that means the difference between CMMC level 1, which is 17 pretty simple things, or CMMC level 3, which is 130 not so simple things. So it's a pretty big fork in the road that, essentially every contractor has to decide which branch of that road they're going to take based on the work that they do for the DoD. It's a big delta, and it makes a big difference to them in terms of budget, timeline, et cetera. So we get a lot of questions about CUI, and so I'm really happy to have you here today as a resident expert on the CUI topic, and we're hoping you can answer those questions that we see a lot, as well as point us to some useful resources related to CUI. So the protection that CUI demands, I mentioned 130 controls in CMMC, it's a big uplift. That extra protection's there for a reason, right? This data is stuff that's targeted by our adversaries. Can you give us a little bit of background on the CUI program, why it exists, why certain information has been singled out for this additional protection, and what's the impact of this on national security?
Yeah, of course. First off, thanks for inviting me and hosting this. I do work for the office that's the executive agent. My boss, Mark Bradley, is the executive agent for the program. Oh, my apologies. No, of course. So the Information Security Oversight Office is responsible for implementing and overseeing the CUI program. So quickly put, and the simple, boring answer for why we protect this information at a higher level is because there's a law, regulation, or government-wide policy out there that identifies that this information requires protection. And if there's a law, regulation, or government-wide policy that identifies the type of information and says you have to protect it, then you have to do so above the baseline protection of any and all information that the government handles. So that's kind of how we arrive at a very minimum of the moderate confidentiality impact value for the government. But that's really only half the story. The purpose and the background of where the CUI program comes from is that as an information security program, the government was doing a bad job almost across the board of protecting sensitive information that wasn't classified. Whether it was national security related privacy information like the OPM data breach, whether it's critical programs and technology related information being stolen or taken from the defense industrial base, or other types of data breaches affecting other types of sensitive information throughout the executive branch that's covered. So the information was being taken, and it's information that is either sensitive to the individuals or sensitive to the government, or many times related to national security but not classified. So the CUI program is intended to tie minimum security standards, whether they be cyber or physical, to information. The government already has a process to figure out what level an information security system has to be secured at. What this said was, for anywhere where this type of information, anything that gets identified as CUI, you have to meet these minimum cybersecurity requirements, physical security requirements, and destruction requirements. And you have to mark and identify the information so that your employees and workers understand that it requires additional protections from what they generally work with.
Cool. So CMMC, which is kind of our focus, is DoD specific, but CUI is a government-wide program, as you mentioned. Can you give us an idea of some of the types of data? I know that you look at the registry; it's a broad list of things. Can you just hit some of the highlights, I guess, of the types of data, maybe beyond the things that we might be familiar with and thinking about, you know, DoD-related things? What is covered by the CUI program?
Yeah, so the CUI program, the umbrella is absolutely massive. So it not only covers, you know, things that we think of from DoD and intelligence community, things like unclassified nuclear information or unclassified intelligence information, or, you know, geodetic product information in the unclassified realm, but it also covers things like potential historical archaeological sites. You know, as they're being researched and the work is being done to declare them, that information has to be protected prior to being done. Everyone knows that, you know, their tax information qualifies for protections under both financial law, tax law, and privacy law. But the IRS also has to protect information relating to how and when and why they decide to conduct audits, because otherwise that information could be gamed to avoid auditing. There's a lot of different information out there that the government requires to protect in order to serve its functions. The census is an excellent example. Getting early access or access to privacy information before it's been appropriately consolidated and anonymized could be tragic for the production of the census in the future. However, that data is incredibly valuable not only to the government, but to the people of the United States and programs that are based off, that are, you know, done on their behalf. So protecting that information, you know, it sits in every executive branch agency has a little bit of it. So it's a very wide umbrella.
Cool. So you mentioned earlier that this is not classified information. What is the sort of dividing line when you look at items that need to be protected, where the government has an interest in protecting it, that would make something classified as opposed to CUI?
Yeah. So the CUI program and the classified program are two separate programs that kind of work together. As mentioned, in the CUI program, it's law, regulation, and government-wide policy based. So it's, you know, when Congress or the government has taken an action to declare that this information requires protection when we're handling it. The classified national security program, you know, that decision doesn't change. It's still based on, you know, a degree of damage to national security is what allows for an authorized individual to original classification authority to classify the material pursuant to that. And many times, you know, those decisions, there's information that is valuable to national security that doesn't have the ability to be classified. Either it requires dissemination to too wide of an audience, or it can't be supported by, you know, security classification and access and infrastructure because of how wide the distribution of that information is, but it's still incredibly valuable to protect that information, and it's generally identified in a law, regulation, or government-wide policy. So they work well together, but when the government has the ability through an OCA, Original Classification Authority, to classify information in accordance with that program, and then the CUI program is, you know, all the stuff that's not classified that requires protection.
Got it. Very good. Thanks. So what's your role? You mentioned you work in an office, which is the executive agent, supporting the executive agent. What's your role in working with the different agencies, specifically the DoD, since that's sort of our interest? What's your role in terms of working with them on implementing the protections of CUI?
Yeah, so currently we serve kind of two roles. So we're designated as the executive agent, and Oversight's in our name. We're the Information Security Oversight Office. So our goal is to oversee the implementation and continuously monitor, essentially, the implementation and efforts of CUI programs at executive branch agencies. As agencies are still very much in the implementation phase, we're very much in the assisting with implementation. So if you go to our website, which we'll link to later, things of that nature, we've issued notices to assist agencies with interpretation of policy and implementation guidance. So we work with all of their CUI program offices. One of the requirements of the CUI program is for all agencies to establish a senior agency official and program manager. So we work with those designated individuals to assist them with the implementation of their programs. We review policies and training that they're developing, and we conduct essentially oversight of their implementation through our annual report. So they report to us annually on where they are in implementation, when they'll meet the different key deadlines of the CUI program, what, if anything, is causing delays in meeting those deadlines. And then we use that to reach back out to them to assist them with either meeting those deadlines or a better understanding of what issues they're facing as they implement.
Cool. So let me jump into kind of the what does this mean to us questions that we get a lot from our audience from the defense industrial base. So this audience is mostly organizations seeking certification under CMMC. They need to be certified at some point as the program rolls out. And as I mentioned, the program uses CUI as a benchmark to determine the level of protection. So that the number one question we get is, do I have CUI? And how do I tell for sure? I think I might not. I'm not 100% sure. How can a contractor know if they've been given CUI by the government or if they've created CUI on behalf of the government? Who can they ask? How can they get a determination on that?
Yeah, so as with all things contracts and government, the first place to look is your contract, which may identify types of informations or highlight whether or not controlled and classified information is being shared, what types it is, how it's protected, things of that nature. Next would be the point of contact on the contract is really who you're supposed to reach out to. Now, how it's done currently at DoD and where DoD is headed is something that's important. So I like to reference the classified world. Currently, if you were working on a contract with the government and you had a classified contract with them, and you had a question about the classification status of information or things that were classified pursuant to that contract, generally, if there wasn't an answer in your existing paperwork for the contract, you would go to your DCSA rep or your classified security manager point of contact that you have on your DD-254 and ask questions about the classification status. The CUI program up and until sometime in the future, there's no real way to ask a good question about FOUO or SBU or any of the unclassified programs because there weren't designated responsible offices and individuals who were empowered to make decisions about whether or not this qualified for protections or not. So the formalization of the CUI program, the establishment of a senior agency official and program manager supporting policies and procedures, the training and marking changes that are coming will provide kind of the background and framework for better answers to that sort of question when they're asked in the future. Now, our CUI FAR case that's currently in draft at GSA goes a step further and actually it currently includes a standard form that that would accompany any contract that states whether or not there's CUI in the contract, what types of CUI are in the contract, whether or not any of it requires special handling or cybersecurity requirements or anything like that. So we've gone down that route. I know DoD has some guidance out there for how to go about identifying what they call CDI or CUI currently in their contracts, and they have that on the DoD procurement toolbox, which I'll put up some slides to and so that people can get those resources as well.
All right, good. Is that procurement toolbox is something that's out today that the DoD has already released? Great. Yeah, we'll show the link. That sounds good. Couple questions about specific kinds of data. Proprietary information is something that a lot of contractors have in their systems. Some people feel this may be a CUI. Is proprietary information considered CUI? And can you give us a little flavor on when it might be, when it might not be?
So it depends. One of the most important things about the CUI program to keep in mind is that it's an executive branch program, which means information only qualifies to be considered as CUI when it is created or collected by or for the executive branch or shared from them. So it has to have what we call a government nexus related to it. So, if you flip through the CUI registry, you'll see that there is a proprietary information category. So we know that a lot of industry has looked at that and gone, I guess I have to protect all of my proprietary information as CUI if I do a contract with the government. But if you go back to what I said earlier, that it has to have that government nexus, that CUI proprietary category says that when your company or entity shares information with the government that is proprietary, that we, just like we always have been, will protect it and identify it and protect it as CUI when we receive it. So the only way that your company proprietary information would qualify as CUI is, when it's in the hands of the government. If we give you back your own proprietary information, even if it's marked CUI, if it's your company's proprietary information, you can continue to protect it just how you always would, because it's your proprietary information. An equivalent would be, when I get information back from the government, if I, request a copy of my tax return or something like that, the government protected it as privacy information when they had it, or tax information when they had it. When they send it back to me, I don't need to have a NIST 800-171 approved laptop to look over my own privacy information. It's just my information coming back. So your proprietary information can qualify as CUI when you give it to the government, but when it's on your own systems, if it has not been created or collected by or for the government or as part of a contract with the government, then it likely does not qualify as CUI.
Got it. Kind of a related question. What about personally identifiable information, PII? So that information is protected under some laws, HIPAA at the federal level, some state laws, depending on state of residence and the type of data. Is that data considered PII? Is that data considered CUI?
Yeah, so, it almost goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Always follow all laws for protecting information. Those apply to you regardless of your government contracts. So, privacy, HIPAA, tax law, all that still applies as it normally would. But for the information to be CUI, it has to have that government nexus again. So it's a little harder to answer about PII because the government contracts out personally identifiable information systems and management all the time. So if you're receiving government privacy information, it's going to be CUI privacy. But your internal networks, your HR data, if you're a company, things of that nature, while the government may require you to share that information with them as part of the contracting process in order to assist with payment or vetting or things of that nature, you're collecting it on your own. So it doesn't qualify for CUI protection on your networks. It's the government that will protect it as CUI if we receive it. Now, obviously still covered by the Privacy Act, but it wouldn't really be CUI unless it's collected or created by or for the executive branch. Got
it. So you mentioned a minute ago the DoD procurement toolbox. You mentioned to have a slide. Do you have some other publicly available tools that contractors can use to learn more about CUI, how to make these determinations of what is, what isn't, as far as identifying it and protecting it?
So for identification and whatnot, DoD it's included in the DFAR 7012 language that the information that requires protection is the information that they've marked or identified either on the information itself or in the contract for what you have to protect. And I think everybody knows that DoD isn't where they want to be yet for how well they identify and mark information and the level to which they mark and identify information. And that's part of what the CUI program is coming in to address. As far as additional resources, there's obviously if you have questions about the CMMC program, there's the CMMC website, a training website that a lot of people in industry are familiar with, the Center for Development of Security Excellence, or CDSE. does have a CUI Toolbox that they keep pretty well up to date. You can find almost all of DoD's current regulations and policies about sensitive unclassified or controlled unclassified information on that toolbox. DCSA has a quick page where they reference a little bit about the CUI program and talk about, I imagine that that'll have more information in the future going forward as well. But DoD Procurement Toolbox is, especially their cybersecurity tab, is one of the best resources for finding out about how to comply with DFAR 7012. Any questions you might have about the NIST 801.171 requirements, or the markings, or the incident reporting, or even particular controls can really be found there. I'll see if I can share those slides. So these are some of the resources I've mentioned. You can see them here. The DoD Procurement Toolbox at the top, CMMC question, CDSC Toolbox, and the DCSA CUI page as well. So those are kind of like the best places to go for DoD specific information that they're putting out and sharing. They all work really well. I will note one of the most impressive things about the DoD Procurement Toolbox is it does have a Contact Us link at the top. It'll ask you, the general topic that you're contacting them about. And they've been very good at getting not just pretty quick, but very good answers back to people through that Contact Us. I've heard a lot of good feedback from people who submit questions that way.
Very good. Yeah, maybe just leave that on, or you have another slide? You want to leave that on the screen for a minute for people to grab some of that info? While you do that, I'm just going to ask one more question. Then I'm going to work in a few audience questions because we're getting a bunch of them in here. So some folks are going to err on the side of caution, and they're going to maybe overprotect their systems, basically protect everything as if it were CUI, since there's some confusion over what is, what isn't, maybe sort of a high watermark approach. Is that okay? Is there any reason that the contractors would need to identify all the CUI data and the data flows, or is it okay for them to simply protect all their systems and data as if they contain CUI? Is it okay to do it that way?
So there's a lot of notes that I would have about that. First is, I won't ever tell a company how to spend their money. That's what government contracts and requirements are for, and I don't write those. I just help come up with the security policy that gets baked into them. So, I mean, people ask, how do they draw their boundaries? And we specifically, we have guidance out there that says the NIST 801.171 requirements apply wherever CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted. And as long as your boundaries meet or exceed that minimum requirement, then they're your boundaries to draw. So if you wanted to include information that wasn't CUI within those boundaries because either you want to protect that information or you find it easier or cheaper to do a high watermark, then that's fine. It doesn't necessarily get you out of or really, DoD and contractors and subcontractors out of identifying CUI. So you're still going to want, CUI is going to be marked or identified, and I believe more granularly and better in the future as the CUI program continues to roll out across the executive branch and DoD. And since you have to draw the boundaries where CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted, it's important to know what is and is not CUI in your systems. That's going to be part of your incident response as well. So I would call it a personal decision. It's a business decision about where you draw those boundaries that best fit, whether you want to, keep the CUI world as small as possible and segment it and, have people log into a particular system in order to deal with CUI, or you want to meet it across all of your lines of business is, a choice that businesses get to make. As long as it meets those minimum requirements of wherever CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted.
We have heard, advice from the CMMC accreditation body we've had on this session here, previous sessions, and they've, suggested the idea of kind of shrinking that boundary down to the smallest possible as a way to, limit cost and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think good advice. Thank you. So a couple of quick audience questions. One is, I assume ITAR information is considered CUI. Is that true?
So again, as long as it's created by or for the government, it would qualify generally as CUI. Take your guidance from your contracts and the entities you're contracting with. But under the CUI program, there is a export ITAR category.
Okay. Next one is if the DoD or a prime contractor is purchasing Mil-Spec items with the specification sheets being easily found online or provided by manufacturers, is this considered CUI? Sounds like in that case, the data is already pretty public.
So can't answer for how DoD will protect different Mil-Spec things. It's very different depending on whether it's one of their public standards or whether or not it's something that's being communicated in performance with a particular contract. So that's up to DoD how they protect that. Generally, already publicly available information is not CUI. However, context changes a lot of things. So certain things that may be generally publicly available when associated with a particular program or agency may meet certain protection requirements in the CUI program.
Cool. Next one says, I don't know the context on this. It says, when will CUI marking changes be released? Are there upcoming marking changes that you're aware of?
The CUI program has our marking guidance out there. We have a marking handbook, which can be found on this webpage, bottom left here, archives.gov/CUI, as well as all that other policy and guidance in the top right corner. As far as when will DoD be changing its marking, that's kind of an internal DoD implementation question. I would say stand by as DoD implements the CUI program. I'm sure there's more guidance to follow.
Next one says, please confirm the government is responsible for letting contractors know if the contractor has CUI. In other words, the contractor does not decide they have CUI. The government, through a contract vehicle, lets the contractor know what CUI is associated with the contract and if the contractor is responsible for any CUI marking. Does that sound like the correct interpretation?
Yeah, so in the CUI FARC case, that is what we have drafted. The standard form will actually, the first question on the standard form as drafted is, does this contract include the sharing of CUI or controlled unclassified information, yes or no? Currently, for whether or not you have to meet the requirements of the DFAR 7012 and NIST 80171 and things of that nature, you got to go to the DoD procurement toolbox, and there are multiple Q&As about that exact topic of how do I know, when do I know, and what do I do if I find out I have CUI or information that requires these protections on my contract. And so you got to go to DoD for that specific question.
Sounds like if we haven't already read the toolbox, the DoD procurement toolbox items, we should be all doing that. So that's my takeaway. I've heard you mention it several times, and it sounds like some good information out there.
Yeah, we get hundreds of questions in from industry about DoD and compliance with the DFAR 7012, and I would say 99% of the ones I get are so closely as to be indistinguishable from an existing FAQ on the DoD procurement toolbox.
So read the FAQ first. Got it. We just have about a minute left, so I want to ask kind of one last question pertaining to CMMC. So recognizing that you're not directly part of that DoD initiative, but you do have an advisory role. So I'm assuming at least indirectly, perhaps directly, you get to help shape initiatives such as CMMC. What's your number one message to those folks in the DoD that are working on implementing protection of CUI, as far as your advice to them, the number one thing you try to influence in your role?
So my biggest piece of advice for this is to, just understand that security is increasing and security was going to increase. There was no future for DoD and the executive branch as a whole where we didn't get better at protecting this unclassified information that's so sensitive. It was going to happen. It needed to happen. So when you're looking to implement these programs or you're commenting on these programs, just come from a place of understanding that this is the direction the government's heading in. Security is getting stronger, getting better. I doubt it stands still at this level. I've mentioned before, NIST 80171 isn't going to get less strict at any time. It may become more particular or include more controls or more robust controls, but it won't go the other direction, in my opinion. So security is going to get stronger, and it's important to note we're doing we're heading in the right direction, I think, as the government and industry. We definitely need a lot of help and guidance about how to continue to head in that direction in the best, most efficient way. I think we're doing what we can to share information, but just, continue engaging earnestly, but from the position of security needed to get better. And that security follows this information because, in a cyber world, and the reason we tied this cybersecurity requirements to the information, if this information exists on a network that's not protected, it'll be taken from that network. So it can be protected very well on 100 networks. If it's protected poorly on one, it leaves that one. And that's why we put these standards on the Controlled Unclassified Information Program. And, bear with the government as we learn to get better at identifying and understanding how this information gets shared, not just internal to the government, but through supply chains, so that we can make sure that we're putting the information in the right hands of the right people as needed and protecting it appropriately.
Well, that's really good advice. And I mean, we've all seen the statistics about how successful our adversaries have been in the past in stealing our intellectual property and to our economic and national security disadvantage. So certainly, I think everybody kind of agrees we need to be more successful in preventing that from happening. That means raising the bar. You pointed out it means raising the bar everywhere, right, including the weakest link. So that's really good advice. Thanks, Devin, for joining us. Audience members, thank you for joining us. We are going to be doing this next Wednesday, August 12th. So this is a weekly session every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. So please do join us for future town hall sessions related to CMMC. This one on the CUI was a little bit tangential to the core of CMMC, but I think extremely valuable because understanding what the CUI program is all about and what needs to be protected is really core in decision making around putting protections in place. So anyway, thanks all, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.